So let's talk a little bit about how the risk of displacing anger on the people who try to help us and not on the narcissistic person, because that's too threatening. So many of the experiences of people in narcissistic relationships, especially the more high, moderate to severe relationships, parallel those of people experiencing any form of relational trauma. The hypervigilance, the chronically being on edge, the avoidance, the rumination, the loss of trust. And there's something else. I was recently, as I do, rereading the OG, original, and greatest trauma book of all, Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery. And I got stuck on the section where she was talking about how trauma survivors often displace anger onto their therapists or onto other people who are actually trying to help them, and not on the person who did the harm to them. And she talked about all the reasons for that, that it's safer, all of that. It's sort of the appropriate rage at the inappropriate object. But that really made me reflect on something that survivors of narcissistic relationships do quite often, especially in the early phases of recovery. They lash out at the other people around them and not at the narcissistic person. Survivors may get angry at therapists who are implying that the behavior in the relationship is not healthy. They may distance from friends or family who are observing that the narcissistic person's behavior is not cool, or who are angry at the narcissistic person in their lives, or may simply say to the survivor, you just need to break up. You need to stop talking to this person. Survivors of and in these relationships may become irritable at other people, but retain their normal state of communication with the narcissistic person whose behavior is actually underlying the survivor's distress and despair. As I listened to the book, I was reminded of all the times clients have been like this with me. In fact, the rookie mistake I have made when I was first doing this work was moving in too fast with my clients, with my sort of education and framing that the person in the client's life was narcissistic. I learned not to do that anymore, and over time I learned that it was about listening, caring about the client, validating their experience, and gently nudging them to this isn't healthy, or can you imagine if you saw this happen to your daughter or someone you cared about conversation. Letting them get there themselves. And way back then when I made those newbie errors, and even now when it's clear that there is no excuse for the behavior in the relationship, the clients will get frustrated with me and may displace some of that anger that they have on me, because they sure as hell can't have it with the narcissistic person or people in their lives. At first I felt bad. And I frustrated myself, like, I'm just trying to help you. And the work for us as therapists, too, is to be present and not waver and not be upset by the client's trauma, but to validate and be present. The client already feels as though their situation is problematic enough. Our job as therapists is to not double down on that sense of their situation being too weird or that it's too much and that we can't handle it. Now, as therapists, part of the training is that we're trained to not take it personally. However, if you're not someone's therapist, if you're talking with someone in your life who is in a narcissistic relationship and you're trying to help them, it can really sting, especially when you see them continuing to sort of have life as usual or even being nice to the narcissistic person, but then getting angry with you. And you just want things to be better for them. That's how narcissistic abuse works. It sort of sends a reverberation through the community it is in. Even if you are not directly in a relationship with the narcissistic person, everyone is sort of affected by how it is affecting the other people in those relationships. What is happening? It's that trauma-bonded ambivalence, and it's an attempt to stay safe in these relationships. Relational trauma stays inside of us. It's an unwelcome backpack we carry all the time. Again, as Judith Herman so beautifully puts it, the perpetrator is always there as a third person in the room, even when they are not physically there. Even when the narcissistic person is not there, they are there. Because when we've been in one of these relationships, even if we're not in the same room as them, we still carry these betrayals in our body. And the negative moods we feel, including anger, can come out at other people or situations. And perhaps these may be safer people or safer situations. Our bodies know that lashing out at the narcissistic person or narcissistic offender is pointless and perhaps even dangerous. But there's still anger that has to come out. And when people are trying to point it all out to us and we feel helpless, it can ping that response to get angry. And this may be even more pronounced in people going through narcissistic relationships, because it is not always bad in these relationships. It doesn't always feel like it is necessary to leave. And we recognize that there are needs met by the relationship that perhaps you aren't ready to step away from. And there are fears of what ending the relationship can do, ranging from internal fears, like the fear of being alone, and then the very real fears, like post-separation abuse. Relational trauma is confusing by definition, because the perpetrator is someone you have trusted, loved, and cared for. And the way we hold it emotionally, physically, and intellectually can feel very, very confusing. But remember what the so-called cure is for relational trauma and narcissistic abuse. I mean, I think it's overselling it to call it a cure, but sort of the essential ingredient. And that is support. Simple, compassionate, social support. Validating, safe, attuned relationships. And therapy may be one of them. But you also need those people that aren't just experts, but also friends, other people in your life. So if you're angry at them, it can undermine and put at risk the very thing you need to help you, and thus the perpetual ambivalence the survivor of narcissistic relationships can live in. The combination of your innate empathy, your trauma response, your need for safety, and your confusion is very difficult. So have grace for yourself on the why of this response, which you may have had and may even feel shame about. And you don't need one more thing to blame yourself for. These relationships are so isolating that being angry at the people who support you, while very natural, can also unfortunately contribute to that sense of isolation and leave you feeling even more lonely and more out there without a single accurate mirror, and leave you blaming yourself for burning down more of your own social support. Healing from narcissistic relationships means being curious about the responses you have had for so long, the why of your behavior in the relationship, what happened in the relationship, how you may have even been with other people, your behavior with other people, your loss of trust, your anger at yourself for being hoovered, your grief around the people you lost. Shame is a core issue that comes up in the survivor's story. And remember, so much of it is an internalization of the narcissistic shame that is projected on you. The internalization of the gaslighting and the belief that you are the problem. And then it can be magnified when you witness the lives of others, where it seems as though that they are not caught in these cycles, or when you behave in ways that you don't feel good about. Remember, none of this happens in a vacuum. So much of what you were doing was trying to stay safe in a chaotic, unhealthy situation and love someone who is only there for you some of the time when it was convenient for them. Inconsistency in many ways is actually more painful than absence. Absence you can grieve. Inconsistency sets us up for self-blame. perpetually staying in the denial and bargaining stages of grief, and not ever getting to acceptance. When we are trying to defend something that is often indefensible, we get angry, and sadly, we often get angry at the wrong people. But anger is also a part of grief. So remember that and understand that narcissistic relationships can feel like a perpetual state of unresolved grief, staying in the anguished stages and never quite accepting and finding meaning and purpose in it all. None of this is easy, and you may look back and think, maybe I'm the problem because here I am yelling at people who are just trying to help me. I'm hoping that this gives you some context, because more than anything, working on cultivating and taking care and fostering those sources of support is so important. It doesn't mean you've got to spin out and start getting angry at the narcissistic person, but it can help to understand how these dynamics fall into place. Thanks again.